Hi, everyone who's joining right now. As usual, we're going to wait just a minute or two just until everyone joins, and then we'll get started. Okay, so I'm just going to begin. Thank you all again for joining us for the 5th webinar in the Indigenous Data Management series. I'm Lauren Bosk. I'm a program officer in the research office at the University of Winnipeg. And I wanted to start again today, as I have for the past webinars, by acknowledging that where I am located as an uninvited settler of French and Finnish descent in Winnipeg is on the birthplace and homeland of the Métis Nation, Michif, and on the traditional territory of the Anishinaabe, Ojibwe, Nahiawak, Cree, and Anishinaabe, Oji-Cree people, and a place of importance for the Oyate, Dakota, and Dene-Sulene Dene peoples. This is Treaty 1 territory. I also acknowledge Treaty 3 and the Shoal Lake 40 First Nation area, which is where we get our water supply. And finally, I'd like to remind you all of the resource connecting us today. Approximately 70% of Manitoba's electricity comes from Nelson River in northern Manitoba, located in Treaty 5. I do this acknowledgement to commemorate Indigenous peoples' principal kinship to the land, which has been restricted. The process of land acknowledgements is inspired by the 94 recommended calls to action, which are contained in the Truth and Reconciliation Commission's of Canada's final report. Land acknowledgements are a necessary first step towards honoring the original occupants of a place, and I really encourage all of you to learn about the land you are situated on. This series is hosted by Kishaadigeh, the Manitoba Network Environments for Indigenous Health Research, or NEAR, based at the University of Winnipeg. Kishaadigeh is funded by the Canadian Institutes for Health Research and aims to upskill research capacity and infrastructure for Indigenous communities and organizations undertaking health research in Manitoba. Kishaadigeh focuses on promoting Indigenous self-determination in research through the development of community-based research lodges in partnership with 5 Manitoba Indigenous organizations: the First Nations Health and Social Secretariat of Manitoba, the Manitoba Association of Friendship Centers, the Manitoba Inuit Association, the Aboriginal Health and Wellness Center, and Fearless R2W. As I've said before, data, and by extension data management, is really about sharing and protecting stories. Both as an institution and through the NEAR program, we want to support Indigenous community partners to ensure they have full ownership over their own stories and data. This series, which is hosted by Kishaadigeh and supported by SSHRC and the University of Winnipeg Library, was built with that in mind, and we hope you will continue to learn alongside us from our presenters throughout this series. Information on the final webinar happening in 2 weeks and pre-registration link for this webinar can be found under the news section of the Manitoba NEAR website, which Larissa will drop in the chat for us all. And on the Manitoba NEAR social media platforms. This live session, like those in the past, is being recorded and will be available under resources and webinars of the NEAR website shortly after the presentation. So just a couple of housekeeping items. As always, there will be a short post-webinar survey, and we really appreciate you taking the time to complete this. Alongside this webinar series, we are developing an Indigenous community-based RDM toolkit, which we plan to release next year. The survey will really help in the development of the toolkit, so please send us your feedback and we can make it the best we can. Finally, please feel free to add your questions into the Q&A feature at the bottom of your screen if you're on a desktop with Zoom. At any time, or drop it in the chat. I'll be monitoring those, and we'll post them at the end of the presentation, and we'll make sure we leave some space, as always, for you to gather your thoughts and type out your questions as well. And as I mentioned, the last webinar of this series is in 2 weeks. And I'll mention it again at the end, but please take a look at the Manitoba NEAR website for more information on this. And those who attend and view all 6 of the webinars will receive a certificate of completion for this training. Okay, so after all of this, I'm now delighted to introduce our speaker today, Jeff Doctor. So please take it away.
All right, hello, Skino. It's good to meet y'all. I will share my screen in a moment here. Okie dokie, here we go. So welcome to my talk. My name is Jeff Doctor. I'm Kishaadigeh from the Six Nations of the Grand River Territory. And what you're seeing there is the creek out the back of my family's land. It's not the Grand River, but actually leads into the Grand River. So I like to preface where I'm coming from, and that's quite literally it. So for those not fortunate enough to know much about the Haudenosaunee, translates roughly to builders of the longhouse, or people who build longhouses, meaning we take law, governance, and these kinds of things very seriously. So when it comes to data, sovereignty, I don't want to say it's something that's inherently part of a lot of what a lot of us do, but it kind of is. And so with my family and our history and how we relate to our lands, I've come into this space not intentionally. It was almost an accident to basically figure out how we can manage our land, how we can manage our business that's happening on our land, how we can digitize it so that when my uncle is moving on, we can get everything that he knows to run the place into a data system for the next generation. So I'm not going to get into all that background, but I want to preface that because that's actually how I got into where I'm coming to today, by working with my own home community. And this is outside the Six Nations. This is my own family's land. It's a long story. That actually ended up getting me a job over on the West Coast with the Songhees Nation. And so the Songhees Nation in the Lekwungen territory, that I was land housing coordinator with them. And it was through them that I actually met Anamiki, the company I'm working for now. So Anamiki, we've been in the space for quite a while. My boss, another Jeff Ward, he's been building Indigenous tech for about 18 years. So when I was just starting college, he was over in Silicon Valley doing that. And that's his story to tell. So I'm not going to get into all that there. But the things that he discovered working in the mainstream white tech ecosystems was not exactly optimal. So when he came home, he wanted to build technologies, basically figure out how to meet the needs of the communities he was working with through his own coding skills and things of that sort. So after about a year of that, he realized that after building the same kind of websites over and over and again, it's a lot of kind of manual coding work that can be automated if you build your own content management system. And so that's what he did. And that's what the business still uses today to power a lot of our websites. And fast forward 2010, over time, as Jeff has started working with more and more people, he was working on more complex data projects. And so the CMS then had to adapt and change over time to meet the needs of these more complex data projects. So Sanias is a cultural training software. It's also a web app that people can sign up for and engage in completely over the internet. Again, all custom software, and that's a lot of work to do. So fast forward to 2015, Jeff and his small team of contractors needs more people, more work, more projects, more people to do the work, and more space to hold the people. So this is actually where him and I intersected, because I was working for the Songhees Nation at the time. And Jeff and Anamiki and his team collaborated with the Songhees Nation to build the Songhees Innovation Center. So it's kind of like a co-working space in the government's main building to bring together a lot of folks that are working in tech and a lot of other NGO type things to just have like a co-working space that's on the res, that's on First Nations territory, so that, well, I can get into some of those elements later. But in my work with Songhees Nation and his work with working for organizations like Songhees Nation, we had a lot of parallel challenges. And so doing housing and lands work, it's a lot of bringing together records from all sorts of different sources, paper records, digital records, oral records, and combining them in a way that you can make sense of them, in the way that you can um, summarize a lot of complications, so that when chief and council or when decision makers need to make very challenging decisions based on very limited resources, they're doing so with good information. And so while I'm doing this kind of work and Jeff is talking about building things for this kind of work, we're just like, hey, that's kind of interesting. So fast forward to 2019, I ended up working for Animiki, and that's where I am now. So now I get to go from kind of scrapping together various solutions, everything from just basically a whole lot of spreadsheets with Access or Excel, into building a database with Access, into pretty much like not having a background in coding and trying to hack together solutions. Now I have an entire team of developers and like serious professionals that build these things. And I have the luxury to kind of not tell them what to do, but guide them to meet all these needs. And so that's where we're at today. So this Indigenous data sovereignty concept's been talked a lot about in these previous presentations, so I'm not going to get into it too much here, but I did want to bring up this image because in my mind, this is like the opposite of what Indigenous data sovereignty means to me. We have this very long history and contemporary storytelling that is not by us, it's not for us, it's on the surface, it's about us, but it's really not. These are settler stories. So this is the classic image of manifest destiny, and it's a lie. Like everything about this image is an artificial construct that's been used to justify so much harm. And so when we're talking about Indigenous data sovereignty, really what we're doing is we're taking back our stories, the stories we tell about ourselves, about each other, with each other, and ultimately about the world and the way that we shape it. And so this has a lot of different definitions, Indigenous data sovereignty, but one of the common consensus is that it's ultimately it's based in rights. So it's the idea of the rights of Indigenous people to control, access, analyze, interpret. And there's a lot of words that can go into this because it's a very big field, but when we're thinking about an academic definition, this kind of was the landmark when it came from 2016 book. So ironically, while me and Jeff were talking, and I don't want to say complaining, but collaborating on solutions to various things, we were always been working on elements of Indigenous data sovereignty. We just didn't have the words for it at the time. So now that we do, what this does is this opens up us to networks of folks that have more common language. So when we're describing these common situations that we all experience through colonization, now we can have common language to describe what we're going through. And that's pretty powerful stuff. So again, I want to assert the rights-based aspect of Indigenous data sovereignty, and that it's an inherent right. And this is something that's incredibly important because I'm always worried that we're forgetting the sovereignty aspect and the inherent aspect of this concept. And by we, I'm using the royal we. But what I mean by inherent is that we've always had data sovereignty. We always will have data sovereignty. It just hasn't necessarily been respected. So this is not like a new thing. This is not something that we're trying to establish out of nowhere. It's more we're asserting an existing right, and that right needs to be respected. So that leads me to this talk today, and so thanks y'all for bringing me here. And I'm going to be focusing on 4 kind of key elements. So one thing that was brought up in other presentations is this notion of one size doesn't fit all. So this falls into the bigger theme of pan-indigeneity and this notion that, it's one of the, I don't want to say the downfalls of using common language like Indigenous, but Indigenous is a political concept that is a useful way to bring a whole bunch of very different people together in like an analytic. It's what it isn't is one solid mass of people. Like to be Indigenous means a very specific relation to your peoples. And so this means that you need distinctions-based language, distinction-based approaches. Everything needs to be incredibly distinct when it comes to dealing with Indigenous data sovereignty, meaning that, for example, if I'm working in a Haudenosaunee community, I'm really working with Haudenosaunee data sovereignty. Or if I'm working in a Cree community, that's Cree data sovereignty. And the commonalities between those two methods, yeah, you could call that Indigenous data sovereignty, but the actual action of Indigenous data sovereignty, in my mind, isn't really a thing because it has to be associated with a very specific people. So another element I'll be talking about is this idea of the costs of sovereignty. So sovereignty is a big chunky word that we all use at, again, it's a strange word when you look at where it comes from, the notion of the sovereign in Europe and all that, but whatever, we're doing the best with what we can because we're still using English, which is not optimal, but the good side of all using English is it gives us something that we can relate. So at least we can relate to this idea of sovereignty, but it might be defined very differently. And it has costs. It has costs in terms of work and labor, in terms of how you establish sort of principles, but also money and economics. And so anything that has costs also has risks. And so there's a lot of risks associated with exercising your sovereignty. Because you're taking on a lot of responsibility. And so the classic Spider-Man quote of "with great power comes great responsibility." Indigenous data sovereignty can sound really awesome until you start doing it. And it's like, ooh, now what? So this is where solidarity comes in mind. So ecosystem, another kind of weird word, but if we want to use it, what we can describe is a way that a whole bunch of different peoples from very different nations, very different communities can come together to build common, I don't want to say solutions, but I want to say responses to colonization. And what I mean by that is even through the language of indigeneity, what it does is it enables us to relate to how we've been colonized in similar ways because it's been by the same damn people. And so what that means is that as we respond to our very specific local situations, we can share our findings, we can share what we've learned with others and build tools that are specific to our communities, but universal enough to a degree that other communities that don't have the same privileges can still pick up and run with. So I wish I had a lot more time to go into each one of these things, but I don't. So this is going to be a very quick speed run through a lot of different things. So bear with me. So first of all, I'm going to start with this because being a land nerd and thinking a lot about land and just everything ultimately goes back to the lands. This image I stitched together from a bunch of different data sources. And going back to this notion of distinguished based approaches. So just already very quickly, you can see in red the First Nations, in the kind of purple and a whole bunch of different colors in the north. These are different data sets that describe a whole bunch of different legal relations to land. What these aren't are traditional territories, nor are they, I'm not going to get into the politics of all that, but just at a very quick glance, you can see how colonialism operates just by when you look at the states and look how large reservations are, as opposed to looking at reserves in so-called Canada, which you see in the red. It's this notion of postage size stamps of reserves. So we have to be very cognizant of when we're dealing with sovereignty of peoples. That doesn't necessarily correlate with every one of these dots because a lot of these dots really should be coming together, and the blank spaces in between the dots is still their land. So yeah. So again, just by this very image alone, one size clearly doesn't fit all, because if you're working with one of those little dots, well, that's going to need something very specific to that area. But that said, there's relations between all those. Alex, sorry, you can't get a copy, but I did post on the bottom right side of the screen. If you want to stitch together, this is all open data, which speaks into this notion of be fair and care. So this was brought up in previous presentations, the FAIR principles and the CARE principles. So those, most people are familiar with the FAIR principles. And so this is the notion of findable, accessible, interoperable, and reusable. And so just this particular example of open data and these data sources follows these principles pretty nicely. So just by going to those websites through some various searching, if you know what keywords to look for, I found it, I accessed it, I download these data, and I put it into a QGIS system, and I can reuse it. I can create this image, I can create other data from this image, and so on and so forth. So yeah, that followed nicely under that principles. But when it comes to the care principles, and this is also brought up in previous presentations as well, it begs a more challenging question: is data like this that might seem relatively mundane still has a lot of power? And so what kind of collective benefits the people that these data are about, what do they get out of this being public and open? What authority do they even have to change any of this, to list it, to advertise it, to license it, so on and so forth? Who's responsible for updating these things? Who's responsible for ensuring that when somebody like me comes along and takes it and throws it into a presentation, I'm doing so properly? Because I'm just assuming I can do this, but I could be mistaken. So please don't sue me, and please don't sue the people running this presentation. Sorry. Which speaks to ethics. So again, just because you can do something doesn't necessarily mean that you should. So I'm pretty sure that this is ethical because this is all open data that's part of the public domain. But again, if I found different data sources, I could throw it into a QGIS system with all sorts of satellite mapping, and there's a lot you can do once you have location data. So again, that speaks to the ethics. Just because you can stitch together data, should you? And again, comes to this notion of cost of sovereignty. So often in a lot of our communities, there's a lot of things going on. There's, I won't get into specifics because it's just, anyway, these are rough times for everybody for a lot of reasons, and there's always a lot happening. So when you're trying to convince people of these, I don't want to say nerdy, but technically nuanced arguments about data sovereignty, when you're dealing with like very specific immediate harm, and you only have certain resources to make choices between these things, it can be difficult to articulate the importance of data and how information flows. It's an investment, but it's an investment that pays off in a lot of ways that's not necessarily easy to articulate or as immediate as, say, investing directly into a specific project. So going back to the care principles, when we're thinking about the community themselves, they must see some sort of return on this investment. So the people that the data is about, they should see some benefit in this. And the benefit can also be in terms of its ease of use. And when I say ease of use, I'm using this somewhat as a substitute for time, because Indigenous people are smart as hell and we can figure out how to do anything with enough resources. But there's so many things on fire all the time that when things are easy, it means less time to do it. More people can do it, more people can get involved. And what that also means is it has to be exclusive and exclusive at the same time. So this is the uneasy tension between open data concepts like fair and, I don't want to say closed, but inherently exclusionary concepts like sovereignty. I mean, sovereignty by its very notion both includes certain peoples and it excludes others. It creates kind of boundaries between peoples and others them. And the data kind of does the same thing. So again, Indigenous data shouldn't be open to everybody because of the relationship that we have through colonialism. That means that if it is, then it'll be exploited. And there's an incredibly long history of that I'm not going to get into. So this raises some key questions. These are common questions for all data, but particularly when it comes to Indigenous data, this is an awkward one of who can access data. So again, when we're talking about Indigenous data, we also have to end up with the super awkward question of who's Indigenous and then who represents Indigenous people. And then what can certain people do with certain things? So this requires governance. So just because you're an Indigenous person related to a certain community, well, what's your role in that community? And how have other community members dictated that you have a certain authority to do X with Y? So this access becomes a very tricksy question again, and we can be complacent, or we can be, if we're not careful when we're thinking about data access, then you can assume that just because a person is a member of a certain community, does that necessarily mean they should have access to something? Because we still have to think about privacy and things of this sort. So Again, this is a high level kind of discussion in and of itself, this notion of single source of truth. So this often comes into play with a lot of data systems, of this notion of when you're dealing with a database and we're dealing with sharing information. And we've all experienced this when we share something like a spreadsheet or even just like a Word document. You have the main copy, then somebody copies it, sends it, then you have the subcopy, then you have the copy, then you have the copy, edit, revise one. And then next thing you don't know which source is like the right source. But one of the challenges is this comes into this notion of the universality of truth. And in some Indigenous worldviews, truth is a sticky concept, and there's not necessarily a singular notion of truth. Truth can be flexible and interpreted in very different ways. So again, how does that translate into data? And often when you're thinking of anthropologists, white anthropologists coming into a community, they might be just thinking that there's just one story, one truth that they can get, extract, and then run with. But they talk to 5 different people, they get 5 different truths, 5 different stories, and they then get confused. That doesn't necessarily mean that there's not an underlying truth between these things. But again, how is that reflected in the records, in the data systems, how they're articulated, so on and so forth. And then this has practical aspects when it comes to siloing. So when we're making decisions based on information, on data, again, this notion of access, who can see what and when and how and why. Often our response to a lot of harm is to get very guarded, get very shielded, and for good reasons. So there's a lot of political and practical reasons where you have to silo your data. So this becomes a challenge. And so this map here, this is another map from ISK. What this is, those green dots are basically just kind of locations of a whole bunch of different First Nations, and the red are the different tribal councils associated with them. So I'm not going to get into the politics of all this kind of stuff, but just in a kind of very quick visual overview, you can see that every one of these dots represents its own kind of interests, and some of these dots correlate or at least relate to other dots through tribal councils, political organizations, and all sorts of different things. And so when you're dealing with specific community data going to specific people, again, it gets messy because these dots are all related to each other in a lot of different ways. And so when it comes to accessing data between them, there's a lot of reasons why the data can be siloed. The data can be shielded from each other. And yeah, that gets messy. So in previous presentation, when Dr. Walker was talking about data should flow like water, that got me thinking about just this notion of silo. And she's like, just like the way that she was describing it is beautiful in the sense that when your data is kind of like, if it's stored somewhere because it's this fine balance of, if your data is sitting there in like a little bucket or whatever and it's not going anywhere, there's no value to it, there's no use to it. But at the same time, if it's just like leaking out all over the damn place, then also it loses a lot of value. So let me put it this way, you have to be very cognizant of Indigenous politics at all times when you're dealing with Indigenous data. That's not something you can ignore. And at a higher level, you have to be sensitive to how colonization has impacted Indigenous politics and still does to this day. So again, even these green dots, these are band councils, and that has a very particular history behind every single one of them. Again, context is everything when you're dealing with every single very specific community. So all these things raise more risks when it comes to kind of securing your data and your silos. So then going back to this notion of permissions. And so when you're building any kind of data system, you have to be very cognizant of this idea of roles and permissions. So very quickly, a role is kind of like when somebody has the authority to do something, and then everybody can kind of see what that role is. So you can see, okay, this person or these peoples can do this kind of thing, and then this thing has these permissions to do this other thing. And so that's one way you can get around the kind of siloing aspects, is you have to kind of map out the kind of the politics of why those silos exist in the first place, and then figure out solutions to create kind of roles and permissions that these various people can like, I don't want to say opt into, but at least agree upon, so the data can flow between these different silos. And then the thing is also with all software is that it has to constantly be updated. And so part of the reason you have to silo your data is for security reasons. And security reasons mean is there's this constant don't want to say battle in software development, but basically every time you build something, there's always holes in it, and there's always people seeking to exploit those holes. And that means you have to update your software, or you want to add new features and things of this sort. But when you're updating your software, you have to make sure that you're not either creating new holes or breaking what you already created. So if you're thinking of like, renovating a house, you might be like, oh, I really want this nice open kitchen, but I'm going to tear down this wall to get it. Yeah, but then you tear down the wall and your roof collapses because there's load bearing. Oops. So same kind of thing when updating your data and your data systems. You have to be very cognizant of the choices you make. And then going back to this notion of interoperability. So in the image behind there, when you see these kind of red lines between everybody and the politics of all this, when it comes to communicating with each other, our data systems being able to communicate with each other, and this goes beyond just the band to band level, but this is like, a band to university level, or a band to traditional government level, or a band to a municipal level, or a band to a federal level, or a band to, and this network of where data must flow requires a lot of interoperability between these softwares and technologies. And at the really kind of like high level, we really do have to work together as we're building out these ecosystems, because none of us has the full solution to really anything. We all have different little pieces of the puzzle that if we can figure out how to combine these efforts, and we can figure out in common when we're building things, how can we give back so other communities, other peoples can benefit from some of the work that we've done. So this notion of this data ecosystem, you can think about this in terms of just the software that's out there. So I won't be going into a deep review of every one of these softwares, but I want to give at least a shout out to a bunch of them. So these folks are Maori. They're doing similar stuff to what we're doing, except they're doing it through a different tech stack with their genealogy software, which is really cool. I really recommend you check them out. Same thing with Mukutu. I can never pronounce that right. Really cool stuff they're doing. I highly recommend you look at their work, and Local Context Hub as well. So this is the traditional knowledge labels. It was talked about in previous conversations. I'm not going to get into all these. I just wanted to leave this through, and you can always pause and look at this later and then grab those links. So Indigenous mapping workshop. This is coming together. A lot of practitioners. They just actually had their workshop last week or something. It was really rad, and really recommend you check them out, because they take a lot of these tools and they show people how to use them for their communities and so on and so forth. So other tools like Terra Stories, Mapio, and here's some more. So I want to, the Earth Defenders Toolkit, that's relatively new. That is a resource that is a good hub to find a whole bunch of other tools that you can use. The Indigenous Navigator, that's sort of outside of the scope of this presentation, but it's also something I wanted to point towards. This is European Union and Danish Institute of Human Rights. There's a long story behind all that, but another thing that you could check out, that's rights-based software that's not really meant for a North American audience, but maybe there's some ways that we could use it. I don't know. Here's some more here. Noodly is really cool. They're doing also a lot of really neat mapping stuff that's very much community oriented. And then non-Indigenous software, like here's where it gets messy again, is that a lot of these softwares I've just pointed to, they might have some Indigenous people involved. They might have no Indigenous people involved. They might be just good tools that Indigenous people can use. They could be horrible corporate tools like Google that we can do our best to take advantage of, but we have to be very cognizant of what are we giving away when we do so. And that's always the kind of fine balance with any software, really, that you yourself are not building and controlling and owning. Is there's always like a cost benefit analysis you need to do about what are you giving away. And so when you're dealing with things like Google, chances are it's free because you're the product. And so sometimes that's okay, question mark, sometimes it's not. And other programs that might not be built by Indigenous people, but they're built in a lot of collaboration or for Indigenous people, again, can be very useful. So that was just a quick kind of run, and you can, like I said, you can pause, you can look through these things later. The next thing I want to talk about real quick is this notion of, in a perfect world, if every one of us could build our own complete tech stack to solve our own very particular like use case scenarios, like what would that look like? And so I want to point to like the 7 layers of actually building out an application. And so this was shared with me by one of our developers because, like I said, my background's in sociology. So everything I know about tech, I learned mostly through like my mom and then just like doing stuff, hacking away at solutions. But I'm very more interested in the social elements. So I know certain layers of this process, and then it gets to other layers, and I'm not an expert in this. So I'm going to at least point to them. So the first thing that you often see is, the app, the thing that you're actually dealing with. So this is what most people often think about is only just this layer here. When you're dealing with the software, this is software you're interacting with. This is what you see, what you use, so on and so forth. And there's obviously a lot of work that goes into that. And so when I'm saying custom app, again, it's going back to this notion of Indigenous peoples, we all have very specific challenges. And so there's a certain layer of customizability that we always have to be aware of. And then to create a custom app, you need custom code. And so once you start getting into the code level, this gets messy because custom code can mean whether you have to hire a developer to literally write everything, or there's no code or low code solutions. So even some of the tools I pointed to earlier can have kind of options that even if you yourself don't know how to code, the software itself can be designed so that you can still effectively code, but you don't realize you're doing it. And so again, the more that this is possible gives you more flexibility to determine your own very particular solution that you're trying to build. And so one way that this is done are through these different programming frameworks. So again, this is start getting to like where I don't understand what's going on and I need my developers to teach me because my understanding is that like a programming framework is when you're taking kind of like shortcuts. I shouldn't say shortcuts, but it's a way to build in ways that kind of like guardrails. So it's inherently more limiting, but you can do a lot more by just having a pre-existing framework. So in Animiki, when we're building a lot of stuff, we're using Ruby on Rails, and it's called Ruby on Rails because what it does is it takes the programming language, Ruby, and puts it on Rails. So guidelines, basically. So you can do stuff a lot faster, but because there's Rails there, you can only do so much. And so the trick is in your framework, how much flexibility are you willing to lose, but then how much do you gain in basically the ease of building something? It's just faster. And so programming languages, here's where you can start getting to really meta ideas of language. And a lot of these languages, each one of them has their own history. And again, I'm not going to get to the comp sci stuff of that, but these are all abstractions of zeros and ones, ultimately, when it comes down to it. And these are pretty much all built and run and developed by settlers, which again raises a very interesting question: is how Indigenous is a software when it's basically still the language that built it is non-Indigenous programming language, and where are we going? I'm sure there's people that are working at this layer, and it's really cool, but outside of what I have time to talk about here. And then operating systems. So this is what you think of like Windows, Mac OS, or Linux. And so here's where you often get trapped into a lot of licensing agreements, a lot of challenges of dealing with the corporate world. So again, you have to make a choice. Is your custom app, it can only run on certain kinds of operating systems. What does that mean? So I have to perpetually buy a license from whoever. Or if it's Linux, what does that mean? Open source. I'm not going to get into all that. But there's a lot of options at that layer. And then the last or second last layer, yeah, it's 6 now, is the hardware. So the actual physical things that you're putting all the software on. Again, there's not really Indigenous companies making Indigenous hardware out there, as far as I know. So, and should there be? I don't know. That's another complicated question altogether. And again, this layer, you still don't really know what is being built. You start getting to more and more closed boxes, and you have to have a lot of confidence that there's not a hole in that box. And then the data center level. So that last layer is often what people think about when they're thinking about data, is like literally, where is the data? Is it sitting on a server? Is it sitting on a hard drive? Is it sitting on whatever, USB stick? But so to actually get the data through the custom app, it's got to go through all these different layers. And so you have to consider pretty much all these real different kind of challenges of how you're navigating your solution through every one of these layers. What are you willing to give up in doing so, and what do you get out of it? So Animiki's role, we're largely at the top layer of building custom software, and one of our key projects is this software called Niwen. And what Newen effectively is a way to balance between all of these different layers to still give people the flexibility to get a custom solution without really the expense to do so. So one of our key missions at Animiki has always been building and supporting software that has been supporting these principles, whether or not that's the language that we use or not. We've just always been kind of doing it. And then same thing, like it's weird when you work for an Indigenous company, and you've been doing so like basically since I left grad school. I've always been working in Indigenous spaces, and you just kind of take these things for granted, I guess, because then when you start talking to Indigenous folks that are working in non-Indigenous environments, they struggle so much to have these things recognized, appreciated, and accepted. And yeah, it's like an uphill battle when you're working for non-Indigenous spaces to just have these things appreciated. And that's a luxury I get with the team that I work with, is that we just kind of do this stuff and then we do it and they're like, oh, we should probably like recognize that because it's really cool. And then this other aspect of implementing wise practices in data security and privacy. So I say wise instead of best, and this comes from somebody that we're working with. I don't want to name names, but this notion of wise practices comes from when you think of this notion of wisdom. And so even at Animiki, when we operate through the 7 Anishinaabe values, wisdom comes from experience. It comes from gathering knowledge and information and respect for all these things over the ages. And that's very different, this notion of best practice. Best practice can also hint towards this, like somehow there can be like only one way, or there can be like one authority that determines a way. So we try to think about it in terms of wise practices, but again, we have to still deal with the world as it is. And speaking of dealing with the world as it is, this notion of price. So again, sovereignty has a cost, and somebody's got to pay for this at the end of the day. Somebody's got to pay, whether it's in money or whether it's in, I don't know, a lot of corn soup. Like somebody's got to get paid to do work. And what does that look like? Is it affordable? And how can we build these solutions that can still be customizable to meet our needs, but they can be affordable for both parties? So the people doing the work can feel appreciated and valued, and then the people actually getting something out of it, they can afford to do so in a fair way. So another aspect of what we do is we do a lot of writing. So these are a bunch of series I can point to. Niwin.ca, that's our launch page. It links to our Decolonizing Digital series. So that's like a long, chunky, like 6 articles all on Indigenous data sovereignty. So again, I'd love to talk about this stuff all day, but I can't. So I'm just going to point to those resources already there. One of my colleagues, Monica, she wrote this, the middle article there about, so that gets into the more, the arguments about cloud storage versus local storage, things about encryption and things of that sort. So you can check that out. And then this last article, Digital Divide, this is, we started talking and thinking about, I mean, a lot of the work that we do is all based on internet technologies. And so that's one thing I didn't really even talk about in that 7 layers is yeah, that's an app, a local app, but then what happens when that app has to flow on the internet? Again, like we don't own those lines underground. We have very little control as Indigenous peoples over the colonial internet infrastructure that runs through our territories. And so what does that look like? What does access questions look like? What does a sort of digital dependency look like? And yeah, that's a messy question in and of itself that, again, I'd love more time to write about. But these days, I've been working largely on this kind of aspect. So when I'm saying Indigenous data sovereignty must be anti-colonial, I used to use words like decolonize or decolonizing and all that kind of whatever. These are long, chunky academic debates I don't want to get into here, but I think the easiest way to describe it is just, are you fighting back essentially, or are you being co-opted at the end of the day? And this is the cold, hard reality that we have to come to terms with. Colonialism is real, genocide is real, and what are we doing about that? So one notion is always being in mind that governments are not people. And this is very important when dealing with Indigenous software. Again, going back to that notion of accessibility and access rights and roles and responsibilities, like you have to be very careful. If you assume that a First Nations band is the legitimate representation of that people, that will have a consequence. And that's the only kind of warning that I will give, because that band might not actually represent those people. So that when I say people, so the capital P, that's more the kind of the notion of we're talking about Indigenous peoples. This talks to like a very specific us as peoples, not as governments or as bands or as Indian Act, whatever. Like, no, we're actually living, breathing communities of peoples that have our own inherent sovereignty that needs to be respected. So this goes back to this organizing notion of kill the colonizer in your head. That might sound kind of provocative for some people, but we've all been colonized, whether we like it or not, and we're all continuously being colonized. And what does that do? What does that do to the assumptions of when you make choices of who you work with, when you make choices as you build these things, when you make choices of determining who gets priority? Always be cognizant of that colonizing voice that is always whispering in your head. And one notion is Indigenous rights are collective. So this is again another kind of long, chunky conversation I would love to get into. But again, when I'm saying Indigenous is a notion of people, peoples, and place and time, really, that all relate to each other. And so there's no such thing as individual Indigenous rights. That's kind of a contradiction of terms. So when you're dealing with Indigenous data sovereignty, you're dealing with collectives and collectivities. Now, that doesn't mean that individuals within those collectives don't have their own particular rights as well. But there's plenty of frameworks and discussion in the Western school of thought about all that kind of stuff. What there's often lacking is this notion of collective rights and what that means, especially when it comes to free, prior, and informed consent. So this notion of who actually represents these collective rights. This is so important when you're thinking about Indigenous data. Is the key one of the key methods of colonization has always been to find the people that have been conducive to being colonized and then championing them and then assuming that they are the ones that represent the collective. And I always want to leave out the question, like, do they? And you have to make these decisions whether you like it or not when you're building out a data system. So, and I want to leave with this kind of key chunky thing of that data residency and data sovereignty aren't the same thing. And often when you hear data sovereignty, you're often thinking in a non-Indigenous environment of, oh, like your servers are in Canada, so hooray, we're good. That's just data residency. It has nothing to do with sovereignty. And particularly when it comes to Indigenous data on a Canadian server, that kind of becomes controversial in the sense of not everybody who's Indigenous in these lands conceptualize themselves as Canadian. So for example, I'm Haudenosaunee, and so if my data is on a Canadian server and not a Haudenosaunee server, is my data sovereign in terms of residency? I would argue no. Or if my data is on like a Mi'kmaq server, that's still another nation. Just because it's an Indigenous nation, that doesn't necessarily mean that that is a sovereign control of my data. So where the data resides and sovereignty are two separate issues that are related, but they're not the same thing. And this leads into bigger kind of chunkier questions of whose laws actually matter. And so when we're speaking about Indigenous law, and we're speaking about data, and we're speaking about Indigenous rights, we're always in an awkward position where if we don't follow, quote, Canadian law, there's going to be consequences. Some of those consequences could involve criminalization. Some of those consequences could be legal in terms of being sued and X, Y, and Z. And we don't have a lot of say in that at the moment. That kind of sucks, but we deal with it. But we also have our own individualized Indigenous laws we have to deal with, we have to respect. Otherwise, what's the point of any of this? Because if you don't respect Indigenous law, you're not respecting Indigenous sovereignty. And so again, at some point, there's going to be contradictions in those things between colonial Canadian law and Indigenous law. And then whose laws are going to matter when you're building your solution? And this notion of consent, same thing. When you're consenting to a data sharing agreement, who's consenting to it? How are they consenting to it? All these kinds of, like, consent itself is such a massive question that I think needs to be explored further. And this notion of owning data, when we're talking about being able to access data, consent to it, whose laws matter, all these kinds of things, ownership, another weird, sticky question. Going back to if you're not entirely sure who represents the community, and then that representative is the owner, well then in the larger scheme of things, well then does that community really actually own that data? And so we have to be open and honest and transparent about these things and really think very carefully through them. And then this kind of larger question isn't just for Indigenous data, but all data. One of the challenges we always have is because we simply don't have the means to control our own internets or our own servers or all these kinds of things. One of the workarounds is just encrypt the hell out of everything. And really quickly, encryption is basically a way that you can still have the data flow through things, but you're the only one, at least the people with the encryption keys are the only ones that can actually basically make sense of it. So when we're talking about data residency, and let's say my data is on a Canadian server, but it's super encrypted and there's no way that anybody can access it other than the people that are supposed to access it, does it really matter where it is in that kind of that sense? But then larger kind of debates about encryption is currently every state in this world is frantically trying to rush to figure out how to illegally de-encrypt things, mechanically do it, and all sorts of stuff. So it's kind of like a, I won't say an arms race, but there is a big question about how long ultimately can encryption work. And same thing in this larger scheme of Indigenous data sovereignty. We're thinking generations. So whose laws matter and for how long? So just because Canadian law is important right now, is it always going to be? Same thing with consent and this idea of ownership. We have to think of when we're building anything in Indigenous data, we have to build it to last. And we have to be able to imagine other worlds as possible, because countries, borders, governments, they come and go, but Indigenous peoples, we're always going to be here, we're always going to have our data, and it's not going anywhere, neither are we. So now thank you all very much for listening to what I said really quickly. I don't see any questions or comments or whatever so far, but y'all can visit us at animedia.com. I'm very active, probably too active, on Twitter at Jeff a Doctor. And I use that as a reading list, and I post a lot of stuff there that can take you down a lot of fun rabbit holes. Yeah, I see a question coming in. I'm going to take a quick break. Yeah, Lauren, you want to take over?
Sure, yeah, Jeff, I was just going to say thank you so much for sharing all of this information. I think just like the other presentations we've heard, there's always so much to take in. So I know that everyone will probably sit with this as well and be able to come back to the recording. And one of the questions that was posed about getting a copy of the presentation, the recording of this presentation will be available on the Manitoba NEAR website, as I mentioned earlier, but not the slides won't be sent out separately. It'll kind of be all brought together. And there is one question in the Q&A that I'll post to you. And so it's from Danielle Bitts, who says, I appreciate your position on the diversity of Indigenous perspectives. I also wonder if you have some thoughts you would consider sharing about the ways that digital and data sovereignty can affect our agency or our perception of as Indigenous students, researchers, and citizens within a colonial state. So really thinking about agency.
If we only have 7 minutes, I'd love to talk more about this. That's a tricky question. Mm-hmm. But it's important. I like this notion of perception, even within a colonial state. So I'm just trying to think of a different way I can rephrase that question in my head, because it's not sinking in. And so is this coming from a non-Indigenous person? Like, I'm sorry, Daniel, can you elaborate somehow? Maybe my brain is just overloaded right now, but I can't think. Okay, there we go. How can we affect change? Yeah, honestly, when it comes down to it, is a lot of us non-Indigenous people, like whatever, we're all figuring this out as we go along. And respect and friendship and trust are key principles when it comes to working together that we have to take very seriously. And so when we're thinking about how we're affecting change, we have to listen to each other. We have to really respect that all of us coming into these positions are going to have different strengths and different weaknesses. All of us are going to have a lot of things to learn, to unlearn, quite frankly. And if we can do so in a respective way, we still have to work together. I feel like a politician with this answer because I can't figure out like a very condensed, quick one. I'm sorry.
No, I think you're right. It's a huge question, right? And I think that there's so many ways of taking it up. So no, that's all right, Danielle. I think that it's an important question too. And so thank you for asking it. And I feel like it's, at least from hearing your presentation too, right? Like, and as you said, right, it's an ongoing process. It isn't something that can necessarily be defined really easily either. So thank you so much, Danielle, for your question. Thinking practically, I did get a question in the chat about the fact that, and we've seen this in other presentations that we've had in this series, that Western academic institutions have access to data storage and sharing platforms, like say, for example, Compute Canada, that are free or low cost to them because of the institutional kind of buying power. But are there similar solutions and services for Indigenous communities or organizations that you know of?
Not that I know of off the top of my head.
Okay,
We're
that's
still,
fine.
yeah, God, we're still in such early, I guess we're taking baby steps here.
Mhm.
I guess is maybe coming back to the original question that was posited, is that honestly, it's been my experience, particularly in tech, just the very notion that Indigenous peoples are still here, that we exist, that we have agency, as was described, that we always have. And that's why when I brought up like this notion of Indigenous data sovereignty being an inherent right, this isn't something new that we're just figuring out. Like, it's always been there, it just hasn't been respected. Same thing with us as peoples. And so when it comes to this relation, like, we have to really think very carefully about the relationships that were created moving forward. And if you're basing any relationship on a kind of paternalistic need to protect, or God, and a big one that comes from like anthropology is like preserve or save, like these white savior relationships. Like, I was about to swear and I'm not going to, I promised myself I wasn't, but we can't do that anymore. And quite frankly, Indigenous peoples are tired of that, and we're not going to put up with it. And so people have to be willing and able to hear no a lot more. They have to be able to listen more and be able to ultimately recognize that there's going to be a lot of cases where you were an expert one day and now you're not, because you just found out that Indigenous people exist, basically. And quite frankly, even me personally, growing up, I've always had status, I've always had that privilege in a way, which is also not a privilege when I get into all that, of having status, but I never really understood what the hell it meant until, ironically, after I left university. So it wasn't until I went back home that I understood that we live in an apartheid system where I don't have the same legal rights as everybody else. My family has gone through all sorts of stuff legally that the Canadian state has dictated through its laws that are unjust, unfair, unethical, and just, again, I'm trying really hard not to swear. But so I go back to this notion of we're still here. We have rights. We've always had rights. And whether people like it or not, if you think I'm forceful when it comes to these things, the next generation are going to be a lot more forceful. They're going to have a lot less patience than me and then my parents' generation had. And they're not going to put up with this anymore. So again, it's the sovereignty aspect of Indigenous data sovereignty, is that we have to fully appreciate that Indigenous peoples, this is our lands. We're always going to be here. And our stories are always going to be here. And they're not for settlers to take. This relationship of exploitation is over. So I will just leave it at that.
That's perfect. Thank you so much. There aren't any further questions in the chat or the Q&A, and there's some like really thoughtful and thankful comments in the chat to you, Jeff, for your time and your expertise that you brought to us today. So thank you so much again for joining us and sharing all of this. Just for everyone who's still here, please sign up for the last webinar in a couple of weeks. It'll be again Wednesday, November 24th from 12 to 1 Central Time again on managing access to Indigenous data. So that's going to be a great end to the series. And finally, remind everyone to please fill out the post-webinar survey to help us with the development of the toolkit. So again, thank you so much, Jeff, and thank you everyone for attending. And I hope you all have a great rest of your Wednesday.
Yeah, thanks all. And I do want to give one last shout out because I have to. To Land
Please.
Defenders of 1492 Land Back Lane, y'all are the best. And to protect the track. So basically, long story short, if anybody here is over in Toronto or over in Six Nations, the Grand River Territory, the Haldeman track, it's ours. Again, this notion of protecting the track. I want to recommend y'all check this out, or no, us. Check out Protect the Track on social media and things of that sort.
Great, thanks so much.
Yeah.